Hit that like button and subscribe, because you don't want to miss the wild ride through history's most absurd oddities. Ever wondered what medieval punishment involved a giant wooden horse? Or how ancient Romans kept their public baths steamy, and not just from the water? Buckle up, because we're diving into a world where the bizarre was the norm and the grotesque was just another Tuesday. Picture this. It's 1347, and while you're busy dodging the bubonic plague, your neighbor might be getting publicly executed for the crime of being a witch, or for simply having a cat. Yes, you heard that right. Cats were once considered diabolical creatures. And speaking of the devil, did you know that in ancient Egypt, people believed that having a pet crocodile was a sign of wealth? Who needs a dog when you can have a 3-ton reptile lounging around your living room? But wait, there's more. Ever heard of the dancing plague of 1518? Imagine a whole town strutting their stuff until they literally dropped. Talk about a dance-off gone wrong. And let's not forget about the medieval practice of trial by ordeal, where you could be cleared of witchcraft by plunging your hand into a cauldron of boiling water. Spoiler alert, if you survived, you were innocent. If you didn't, well, let's just say you wouldn't be around to argue. So, what's the deal with these wild practices? Why did people think it was acceptable to dunk their hands in scalding water or to use leeches for a good old-fashioned bloodletting? Stick around as we unravel the strange, the shocking, and the downright ridiculous moments in history, complete with specific dates and jaw-dropping facts. And hey, if you're feeling a little sleepy after all this chaos, just turn on loop and let this episode play until you drift off, because who doesn't want to dream of medieval torture devices? The Unexciting History of Roman Senate Quill Ink Drying Times. Ladies and gentlemen, gather round as we delve into one of the most thrilling, nay, utterly exhilarating, chapters of history, the unexciting history of Roman Senate Quill Ink Drying Times. Yes, indeed. While the Roman Empire was busy conquering lands and building aqueducts, someone had the audacity to care about how long it took for their ink to dry. Who knew that in the heart of such monumental achievements lay the secret drama of ink drying? Prepare yourselves for a roller coaster ride through quill, ink, and the sheer suspense of waiting. ##### the dawn of ink. Let us first set our quills back to 500 BCE in the bustling city of Rome. The early Romans, armed with primitive bamboo reeds and a concoction of soot and water, the original ink, began documenting their thoughts. Ever wonder how they managed to record their legal codes and achievements without the luxury of a quick-drying ink? The answer: they didn't. It is estimated that their ink drying times could stretch anywhere from several minutes to, wait for it, days. Yes, days. Who had the time to wait for ink to dry when you're busy plotting your next conquest? #### the Quill Revolution. Fast forward to 400 BCE, when the quill pen was introduced to Rome. Made from the feathers of geese, swans, or, if you were feeling particularly extravagant, ostriches, these quills revolutionized the writing game. Picture this: a senator, dressed in a toga, quill in hand, poised to sign the latest decree. But what's this? The ink smudges as he leans in to impress the crowd. Talk about a faux pas. Hashtag 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 the Quill Chronicles. Materials: goose feathers, swan feathers, or ostrich feathers, for the elite. Drying times: 5 to 30 minutes, depending on the humidity and the quality of the ink. Notable users: Cicero, a renowned orator, was known to have a particularly smudgy signature. Hashtag 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 the ink dilemma. By 200 BCE, Roman senators had begun to realize that not all inks were created equal. Enter the scandalous world of ink composition. Some senators were known to use inks mixed with fish gall, which not only made the ink darker but also created a delightful stench. Imagine the aroma wafting through the Senate chambers. Delicious, right? But what does this mean for drying times? Fish gall ink, 30 minutes to an hour. Vegetable-based ink, 1 to 2 hours. Now, one must ask, how could they possibly focus on important discussions when all they could think about was the lingering scent of fish? Hashtag 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 the Great Ink Wars. In the 1st century BCE, as tensions in the Senate escalated, so did the competition for the best ink. Senators began boasting about their ink's drying times as if they were gladiators in the Colosseum. My ink dries in 15 minutes flat. Oh, please. Mine is so fast it could outrun a chariot. And thus, the great ink wars commenced. Senators would gather in secret meetings, often referred to as Inquisition sessions, where they would swap tips on how to hasten drying times. Some even tried bizarre methods, such as using powdered egg whites to thicken their ink. Imagine the horror of an eggy mess at a crucial vote. Who thought that mixing breakfast with politics was a good idea? Hashtag 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 the rise of the papyrus. By the time the imperial period rolled around in 27 BCE, papyrus had become all the rage. This lightweight writing surface changed everything. With the introduction of papyrus, ink drying times became even more critical. Who wants to ruin a perfectly good scroll because of a careless smear? Papyrus sheets, 5 times more absorbent than parchment. Ink drying time, 15 to 40 minutes, depending on the ink and application. However, this newfound efficiency came with its own absurdities. Picture a senator dramatically waving his scroll, only to have the ink still wet and dripping down the page. Look, I'm making art, one might quip, as the ink runs like a watercolor painting gone rogue. Hashtag 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 notable ink mishaps. With all this ink slinging, it's no wonder there were a few notable mishaps. 1. The smudged speech of 63 BCE, Cicero, the master orator, attempted to deliver a speech against Lucius Sergius Catilina. Unfortunately, his ink had not dried properly, leading to a rather embarrassing moment of smearing. "I swear it was the ink, not my oratory skills," he famously claimed. 2. The inauguration of Augustus, in 27 BCE, as Augustus was proclaimed the first Roman emperor, a senator accidentally dripped ink on his toga. The senator, horrified, exclaimed, "It's a sign of prosperity." Augustus, with a raised eyebrow, retorted, "Yes, prosperity and a laundry bill." 3. The Great Parchment Fiasco of 19 CE, a senator, eager to impress, used a wet ink formula that took so long to dry, the parchment was still damp by the time he rolled it up to present it. The result? A soggy scroll and a very confused audience. #### The invention of quick-dry ink. By the 1st century CE, the Senate was in desperate need of a solution to their ink-drying woes. Enter the ingenious mind of a certain Claudius Tiberius, who, fueled by a lack of patience, and probably too much fish gall, decided to experiment with various compounds to create quick-dry ink. Ingredients: charcoal, tree sap, and a dash of mystery. Drying time, 3 to 5 minutes. Imagine the excitement. Senators could now sign decrees faster than they could argue about them. But, as with all great innovations, there were side effects. Some senators reported that the ink had a peculiar taste. "I'll have my ink, but hold the fish gall, please," became a popular saying. ###The legacy of ink drying times. As the centuries rolled on and the Western Roman Empire crumbled into the annals of history, the legacy of ink drying times continued to affect scribes and scholars. Fast forward to the Middle Ages, where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts with quills and inks that often took ages to dry. One can almost picture the frustration of those dedicated scribes, yearning for a quick-drying ink that would save them from the endless smudges. But what can we learn from this riveting history? Perhaps it's that even in the grand tapestry of empires, the minutiae of ink drying times can lead to some truly absurd situations. Who knew that the fate of a senator could hinge on the drying time of fish gall ink? In conclusion, as we reflect on the riveting narrative of Roman Senate quill ink drying times, one must ponder, who truly cares about the ink drying times of a bygone empire? Perhaps it's just a reminder that even the most mundane details can lead to some of the most entertaining stories. So next time you find yourself waiting for something to dry, whether it be ink, paint, or your lunch, remember the Roman senators who endured far worse. And if you happen to smudge something, just declare it a new art form. After all, history is written by those who dare to take risks, even if it's a risk of ink on their togas. #### The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. In the grand tapestry of Roman history, where gladiators clashed in the Colosseum and emperors ruled from opulent palaces, one might think that the most riveting tales would emerge from the battlefield or the Senate floor. Yet, lurking in the shadows of this illustrious past is a tale of ink, quills, and the absurdly mundane, specifically, the drying times of quill ink used by senators. Yes, you read that correctly, the unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. #### Construction methods, materials, and costs. To understand the significance of ink drying times, we must first delve into the construction of quills and the ink they used. The quills were typically crafted from goose feathers, chosen for their size and durability. The process began around 753 BCE, the legendary founding of Rome, when artisans mastered the art of shaping these feathers into effective writing instruments. 1. Materials used asterisk. Feathers asterisk primarily goose and swan feathers, with the occasional use of crow or raven for specialized tasks. Ink ingredients asterisk. The ink was a mixture of soot, from burnt wood or oil lamps, gum arabic, for binding, and water. This concoction was often boiled to achieve the desired consistency. Containers asterisk. Ink was stored in small clay pots or glass vials, many of which were intricately decorated to reflect the status of the owner. 2. Costs asterisk. Training a skilled scribe in the art of quill preparation could cost around 100 denarii, equivalent to several months' wages for a common laborer. A pot of good quality ink could range from 5 to 15 denarii, depending on its ingredients and the artistry of the container. While we may be tempted to think that ink was a mere commodity, it was, in fact, a status symbol. Senators often prided themselves on the vibrancy of their ink, as it spoke volumes about their wealth and influence. ##### Bureaucratic rules and punishments. The bureaucracy of the Roman Senate, an institution known for its complex rules and regulations. The rules governing ink usage, drying times, and even the penalties for infractions might not have made the front page of the Acta Diurna, the daily gazette of ancient Rome, but they were nonetheless crucial. 1. Bureaucratic rules asterisk. Senators were required to use only approved ink blends. Unauthorized mixtures could lead to severe consequences, including public humiliation. The drying time for ink was officially set at a minimum of 10 minutes before parchment could be folded or handled. This prevented smudging and ensured that the written word would endure. 2. Punishments asterisk. If a senator was caught folding a document too soon and ink smeared all over it, they could be fined 50 denarii and subjected to a public reprimand. The shame of having your ink smudge was akin to a modern politician being caught in a scandal, requiring damage control and backtracking. Repeat offenders faced harsher penalties, including a temporary suspension from Senate duties. Imagine sitting at home, twiddling your thumbs and waiting for ink to dry, all the while knowing your peers were debating matters of state. ##### roles and job descriptions. Within the Senate, there were various roles that directly or indirectly influenced ink usage and drying times. Let's explore a few of these positions. 1. The scribe asterisk. Responsibilities asterisk. Tasked with drafting official documents, the scribe was the first line of defense against messy ink. This role required a steady hand, a good eye, and a penchant for patience. Skills needed asterisk. Mastery of cursive Latin and an understanding of ink drying times, because a quick scribble could lead to a hasty error. 2. The quaestor asterisk. Responsibilities asterisk. Often responsible for financial matters, quaestors would oversee the procurement of ink and quills. They were essentially the budget managers of the Senate's writing supplies. Skills needed asterisk. Knowledge of market prices for ink and a knack for negotiation, especially when dealing with feather merchants who often ran the risk of inflation. 3. The censor asterisk. Responsibilities asterisk. Charged with maintaining public morals, censors had the authority to investigate ink-related offenses. If someone's quill was found to be too extravagant, the censor could issue a warning or reprimand. Skills needed *, a keen eye for detail and a talent for making the mundane seem monumental. Your quill choice is an affront to the dignity of Rome. Witty asides aside, it's clear that each role played a part in the larger narrative of ink management within the Senate. ###### technical specs and inventories. Now let's get into the nitty-gritty of the technical specifications and inventory management related to quills and ink. Roman senators were nothing if not meticulous. 1. Quills *. Length * typically ranged from 8 to 12 inches, with the ideal taper beginning 2 inches from the tip. Bend *, a slight curve was preferred to facilitate a smooth writing motion. This bend was often achieved through baking the quills in warm sand, a method that also resulted in somewhat crispy feather tips. 2. Ink *. Consistency *. The preferred viscosity was akin to modern-day syrup. If the ink flowed too quickly, it led to smudges. If too thick, it could clog the quill. Color * black was the standard, but some senators favored dark hues with a touch of violet, a sign of sophistication, or perhaps just a touch of rebellion. 3. Inventory management *. Each senator maintained an inventory of quills and ink, recorded meticulously in wax tablets. A well-organized senator could boast of having a dozen quills and 3 varieties of ink at any given time. Quills were often categorized by their drying times, allowing senators to choose the appropriate quill based on the urgency of their correspondence. For instance, a quill made from a young goose may dry faster than one from an older bird. Who knew? ##### The Quill Dilemma, a tale of ink and time. As ink slowly dried, senators engaged in spirited debates, often arguing over matters of state. However, the time it took for ink to dry could lead to unforeseen consequences. At times, senators would find themselves in the position of waiting impatiently for their ink to dry before signing a crucial document. Imagine the scene: a senator, poised over a parchment filled with weighty proclamations, anxiously tapping his foot as the ink refuses to dry. His colleagues chatter away, discussing conquests and laws while he watches the seconds tick by. "If only I had chosen a faster-drying ink," he laments, a phrase that would go down in history as the only thing less thrilling than a debate about agricultural reforms. ######## Conclusion: a legacy of ink. In the grand scheme of Roman history, the drying times of quill ink may seem trivial, yet they reveal a great deal about the culture, bureaucracy, and daily lives of senators. From the construction of quills and the meticulous preparation of ink to the rules governing their use, it is evident that even the smallest details played a crucial role in the functioning of Rome's political machinery. So, the next time you pick up a pen, take a moment to appreciate the centuries of history that have unfolded around the simple act of writing. From the quill to the ink, and from the Senate to the streets, the legacy of Roman ink endures, perhaps not as exciting as a gladiatorial match, but certainly as essential to the flow of history. After all, a well-dried ink is the unsung hero of democratic discourse, ensuring that the words of the past are preserved for future generations. Smudges be damned. The Unexciting History of Roman Senate Quill Ink Drying Times. The Roman Senate, a bastion of political power for centuries, is often romanticized as a hotbed of impassioned debate and political intrigue. Yet, the reality is far less thrilling, particularly when examining the unsung hero of its proceedings, Quill Ink Drying Times. While we might expect tales of gladiators or grand conquests, the history of ink drying in the Senate reveals a surprisingly intricate tapestry of construction methods, bureaucratic rules, and the roles of those involved in the process. Buckle up, dear reader, as we delve into the minutiae of this unexciting yet compelling subject. Construction methods and materials. During the height of the Roman Republic, 509 to 27 BCE, the quill became the pen of choice for senators. Typically crafted from the feathers of geese or swans, these quills were fashioned into writing instruments with a nib that could hold ink. The ink itself was a concoction of soot, gum, and water, with various additives that affected both color and viscosity. The Romans were resourceful and often relied on local materials. The construction of quills was straightforward but required a good eye and steady hand. Senators would often have their quills prepared by a scribe or an apprentice. The process looked something like this. 1. Selection of feathers, chosen for their flexibility and size. Goose feathers dominated the quill market. Swans made an appearance for special occasions. 2. Trimming. The quill was cut to a precise point, often using a sharp knife or a small blade. 3. Sharpening. The nib was carefully shaped to allow for fluid ink delivery, a critical step to ensure that the ink wouldn't dry too quickly or, heaven forbid, leak. 4. Testing. A quick dip in ink and a few test strokes were customary to ensure the quill was up to the task. Nobody wanted to be the senator with the ink-spattered toga. While the quill construction was relatively simple, the ink recipe was a different beast altogether. Roman ink was primarily made from carbon black, soot, mixed with a binder, often gum arabic. This combination allowed the ink to adhere to the papyrus or wax tablets commonly used in the Senate. The costs associated with quill and ink were modest yet substantial enough for senators to consider. A quality quill could cost approximately 1 denarius, while ink was priced at 1/12 of a denarius per ounce. An average senator might spend around 5 denarii per month on quills and ink alone, no small sum when one considers the cost of a loaf of bread was about 1/4 of a denarius. 2. Bureaucratic rules and punishments ***. In the Roman Senate, bureaucratic rules were as rigid as a soldier's stance. Senators were expected to maintain a high standard of decorum when presenting documents, and this extended to the quality of their writing instruments and ink. If a senator was caught using inferior ink that dried too quickly, he could face ridicule or, more seriously, a fine that could amount to several denarii. Each senator was required to submit a written account of their expenses, including quills and ink, to the aediles, the officials responsible for public works and the maintenance of the city. The aediles would conduct random inspections of senators' writing materials, enforcing rules that would make any modern accountant cringe. Some of the more ridiculous infractions included using ink without approval. Senators were required to use state-approved ink, which had a specific drying time. Deviating from this could lead to a reprimand, or worse, a public shaming. Quill quality standards. Senators were not allowed to use quills that were less than 6 inches in length. Anything shorter was considered unworthy of their noble stature. Drying time regulations. If a senator submitted a document that had not dried sufficiently, within 2 hours of writing, they might be subjected to a fine or required to redo the document. As if that weren't enough, there were punishments for those who consistently violated these rules. Senators who showed a lack of respect for the ink drying regulations might find themselves stripped of their toga and forced to attend the next session in nothing but a tunic, an embarrassing fate for any Roman patrician. 3. Roles and job descriptions ****. Within the Senate, various roles were designed to manage the ins and outs of political writing. The primary players included 1. The scribe, the unsung hero of the Senate. Scribes were responsible for drafting and copying documents. They were well versed in the nuances of ink drying times and often had a secret stash of high-quality ink for special occasions. 2. The quaestor, often a young senator. The quaestor managed public finances, including the purchasing of ink and quills. They were also responsible for maintaining inventory, ensuring that the Senate never ran low on these essential supplies. 3. The aedile. As previously mentioned, aediles were in charge of enforcing the ink regulations. They held a certain amount of power and their inspections were dreaded by many. 4. The senator. The senators themselves were expected to uphold the highest standards of writing. They would often dictate to their scribes, ensuring that every letter was perfect and every quill dipped in the state-approved ink. The hierarchy of roles in the Senate reflects the seriousness with which ink and quilling were viewed. After all, a poorly executed document could lead to misunderstandings that might ignite political turmoil. Imagine the chaos if a senator's speech about the construction of aqueducts inadvertently became a treatise on cat care. 4. Technical specs and inventories ****. For those who appreciate the finer details, let's dive into the technical specifications and inventories related to quills and ink within the Roman Senate. 1. Quills. Length, 6 to 12 inches, the longer the better for prestige. Feather type, goose, more common, swan, for special occasions. Nib angle, 45 degrees, for optimal ink flow. 2. Ink. Composition, carbon black, gum arabic, water. Drying time, ideally 30 minutes, but no more than 2 hours. Color options, black, dark brown, and occasionally red for special documents. 3. Inventory requirements. Each senator was required to maintain a minimum of 3 quills and 1 ounce of ink on hand during sessions. Monthly reports to the aediles included details on ink usage, quill condition, and any wastage that occurred, a tedious task, but one that kept the Senate running smoothly. Witty asides. As we journey through this dry topic, pun intended, one must wonder, if the Romans had known about ballpoint pens, would they have avoided all this fuss? Imagine a senator stroking a ballpoint pen across parchment, declaring, "I've got the right stuff." Or consider the poor quester, tasked with managing the ink supply. "I can't take this pressure," they might exclaim, "it's like trying to keep water in a sieve." 6. Conclusion: the lasting impact on the Senate ****. As we wrap up this unexciting yet surprisingly detailed examination of quill ink drying times in the Roman Senate, one thing becomes clear: the art of writing was not just a matter of ink and quills but a reflection of the political culture itself. The meticulous attention to detail, the bureaucratic procedures, and the roles crafted around quill and ink demonstrate that even the most mundane aspects of governance were treated with reverence. While the Roman Senate faced numerous challenges over its centuries-long existence, the importance of maintaining a steady supply of quills and ink, and ensuring they dried appropriately, reminds us that even in the corridors of power, sometimes the smallest details can hold the most significant weight. So, the next time you pick up a pen, spare a thought for those senators of yore, battling bureaucracy and ink drying times, one quill stroke at a time. ###The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. The Roman Senate, a bastion of political discourse and decision-making in ancient Rome, is often romanticized as a grand assembly of toga-clad elites debating matters of state. However, tucked beneath this dramatic veneer lies an equally mundane concern: the drying times of quill ink. Surprisingly, understanding this minor detail provides a fascinating glimpse into the construction methods, bureaucratic rules, roles, and technical specifications of the Roman Senate. #### Construction methods and materials. In the early centuries of the Roman Republic, 509 to 27 BCE, quills made from the feathers of geese or swans dominated the writing scene. The construction of a quill was a meticulous process. Artisans would select the feathers, typically from the left wing to ensure a natural curve, and then cut them to a point. This point was further shaped with a small knife, and the nib was split to allow ink flow. Ink, a mixture of soot and water combined with a binding agent like gum arabic, was often prepared in small clay pots at various locations throughout the Senate. The cost of ink production in the 1st century BCE was about 1 as, a Roman currency unit, per pot, making it a relatively affordable commodity, albeit still a notable expense for senators who preferred to showcase their erudition with elaborate scrolls. Interestingly, the Romans also experimented with other materials. Some senators reportedly used ink made from the juice of certain fruits, while others opted for iron gall ink, known for its rich black color but notorious for its long drying times. #### Bureaucratic rules and punishments. One might think that in an institution as grand as the Senate, the drying times of ink would be a trivial concern. However, the Senate had a bureaucratic framework that dictated everything from speech lengths to record-keeping practices. According to the Lex Julia de Vi Publica, a set of rules established in 18 BCE, senators were required to submit written records of their speeches within a specific time frame. What's worse? If a senator failed to deliver their records promptly, they could face a fine of up to 10 as. The drying time was crucial. Senators were often held accountable for the accuracy of their records. A parchment that had not dried sufficiently could lead to smudged text, potentially resulting in miscommunication or misinterpretation. Imagine a senator mistaking peace for peace in a record of a treaty. Hashtag 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 roles and job descriptions. The Roman Senate was not only a legislative body but also an administrative one, with roles that included the censor, responsible for maintaining the census and overseeing public morality, and the praetor, who managed legal affairs. However, one of the unsung heroes of the Senate was the scriba or scribe, who spent hours meticulously recording debates, speeches, and motions. Scribes were responsible for ensuring that the ink was fresh and that it dried properly before the documents were passed around. They had to be intimately familiar with the drying times of various inks, which could take anywhere from a few minutes to several hours. The scribes also had a unique role in quality control. If they noticed that ink was drying too slowly, they were required to notify the presiding consul, a role that came with significant pressure. A scribe who failed to alert the consul about a drying ink mishap could face a reprimand. In a world where one's reputation was everything, the stakes were high. Hashtag 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 technical specs and inventories. The Roman Senate maintained a detailed inventory of writing materials. A standard kit for senators included quills * approximately 12 quills per senator, as they would often break or become dull. Ink pots * typically made from clay, each senator was expected to have at least one pot, filled with black ink or iron gall ink. Parchment * sourced from various local suppliers. The parchment was usually sheep or goat skin, costing about 5 as per scroll. Writing tablets * for more immediate notes. Wooden tablets coated with wax were used, allowing for easy erasure and reuse. Interestingly, the Romans had a peculiar way of measuring ink drying times. They would often use a simple test, the finger swipe test. If a senator could swipe their finger across the ink without smudging it, it was deemed dry. While this might seem a bit unscientific, it was a practical measure at the time. Hashtag 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 ink drying times, a detailed examination. The drying times of inks varied depending on the composition. A breakdown of the most common types used in the Senate includes 1. Carbon black ink, soot-based. Drying time * 15 to 30 minutes. Characteristics * quick drying, but prone to smudging if disturbed. 2. Iron gall ink *. Drying time * 1 to 2 hours. Characteristics * rich, dark color, but notorious for its slow drying time. Many senators cursed this ink. 3. Fruit juice ink *. Drying time * 30 to 60 minutes. Characteristics * bright colors, but less durable and easily washed away by rain. 4. Mixed inks *. Drying time * varies significantly based on the mix. Characteristics * often used for aesthetic purposes in ceremonial documents. Given the variance in drying times, scribes had to be strategic about their writing techniques. A common practice was to write in sections, allowing the first part to dry while they continued their work. Hashtag the dreaded smudge, tales from the Senate. As with any institution, the Roman Senate had its share of mishaps. One particularly infamous incident occurred in 63 BCE when Senator Lucius Catiline presented a proposal to the Senate, only to find that the ink on his speech had not dried properly. His impassioned arguments were rendered illegible by smudges, prompting laughter from his fellow senators and a swift dismissal of his proposal. Another tale involves the esteemed Cicero, who, during a heated debate, inadvertently smeared ink all over his toga while gesturing emphatically. The incident, known as Cicero's ink blot, became a favorite story amongst the senators, serving as a reminder that even the most eloquent speakers could fall victim to the whims of drying ink. Conclusion, a dry affair. The drying times of quill ink in the Roman Senate may seem like an unexciting detail in the grand tapestry of history, but it underscores the practical challenges faced by one of the world's oldest legislative bodies. Through their construction methods, bureaucratic rules, and the roles of scribes, we see a society that, while often characterized by grand political maneuvers, was equally concerned with the minutiae of daily governance. As we reflect on the Roman Senate, it's crucial to appreciate the interplay of the mundane and the monumental. After all, without proper ink drying times, history could have turned out very differently. Imagine if the ink on the 12 tables had smudged. So next time you dip your pen in ink, spare a thought for the senators of yore, who navigated not only political intrigues but also the treacherous waters of drying ink. The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. The history of the Roman Senate is marred by intrigue, political machinations, and the occasional scandal involving toga-wearing senators. Yet, amid this backdrop of drama, one might find the unexciting yet oddly compelling tale of quill ink drying times, a topic that, while seemingly mundane, reveals a wealth of information about the bureaucratic intricacies of ancient Rome. Construction methods and materials. From the inception of the Roman Republic around 509 BCE until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, the ink used by senators underwent several transformations, influenced by the materials available and the construction methods employed in creating writing instruments. 1. Quills. Initially, quills were made from the feathers of large birds, often geese or swans. The choice of feather was critical. Larger feathers held more ink but required meticulous preparation. Senators had to soak the quills in water, trim them to a fine point, and sometimes even heat them to achieve the perfect writing instrument. 2. Ink ingredients. The ink itself was primarily composed of soot, carbon black, mixed with water and a binding agent like gum arabic or resin. The Romans also experimented with gall nuts, a product of oak trees, to produce a more durable ink. This process was labor-intensive. Scholars suggest that the best inks were produced in workshops that specialized in the craft, costing around 2 denarii per pint in the 1st century CE, a hefty sum for a senator's stationery budget. 3. Drying times. The drying time of ink varied based on its composition and environmental factors. A well-crafted ink might dry in 5 to 10 minutes in a warm, dry room, while cheaper, Hastily made inks could take upwards of an hour, leading to ink smudges that could thwart even the most eloquent of speeches, and potentially spark a political scandal when one senator's parchment was found smeared with the ink of his rival. ###### Bureaucratic rules and punishments. With the Roman Senate's vast responsibilities, legislation, diplomacy, and oversight, a plethora of bureaucratic rules governed the use of quills and ink. These rules ensured that the written word maintained its sanctity and purpose. 1. Writing protocols. Senators were required to use formal script when drafting documents. Any deviation risks severe penalties, including fines or public reprimand. A misstep in ink choice could lead to a senator being mocked in the forum, definitely not the way to maintain one's dignity in a toga. 2. Ink quality control. Each senator was expected to ensure their ink met quality standards set by the Senatus Consultum, a decree that could lead to a Senate-wide investigation if a senator's ink was deemed subpar. Failure to adhere to this could result in having to publicly apologize, a fate worse than being caught with one's toga tucked in one's sandals. 3. Record keeping. The Senate maintained detailed inventories of ink supplies and quill stocks. If a senator failed to account for ink usage, they faced a fine equivalent to the cost of a year's worth of ink, about 24 denarii. This encouraged senators to be meticulous, lest they find themselves inkless in the midst of a heated debate. ##### Roles and job descriptions. In the intricate dance of Senate life, several roles emerged, each with its own responsibilities tied to writing and documentation. 1. Scribes. The backbone of the Senate's written communication, scribes were responsible for documenting proceedings and drafting decrees. They were often slaves or freedmen trained in shorthand and legalese. A skilled scribe could transcribe a speech in real time, though they were often rewarded with the dubious honor of being the first to witness the ink drying, an exhilarating experience for those who had a penchant for the dramatic. 2. Censors. Tasked with maintaining moral standards and overseeing the census, censors had the power to expel senators from their ranks. One of their lesser-known duties involved inspecting ink supplies to ensure they met the proper criteria. A censor who found a senator using inferior ink could subject them to public ridicule. Imagine a toga-clad senator caught writing with a smudge-prone ink at the behest of a censor with a penchant for theatrics. 3. Praetors and consuls. These high-ranking officials had the authority to issue decrees and could dictate the terms of ink use for official documents. A praetor might specify that ink used for legal matters must dry within 5 minutes, nothing like pressure to ensure that senators wrote with both speed and clarity. #### Technical specs and inventories. The technical specifications of quills and ink were as varied as the senators themselves. An understanding of these specifications provides insight into the inner workings of the Senate. 1. Quill specifications. Feather type. Goose feathers were preferred for their size and flexibility. Length. Approximately 12 to 14 inches for optimal control. Point angle. A finely tapered point, ideally 45 degrees, for precise script. 2. Ink specifications. Composition, carbon black, water, and gum arabic. Viscosity must allow for smooth flow without clogging the quill. Color predominantly black, though a few adventurous senators experimented with shades of red or green for personal correspondence, much to the chagrin of traditionalists. 3. Inventory management. Each senator maintained a personal inventory of quills and ink, often recorded on a wax tablet, a far cry from modern-day spreadsheets. A senator's inventory would typically include 10 to 15 quills, to account for wear and tear. 1 pint of ink, to last through speeches and debates. 3 to 4 ink pots, as a backup for unexpected spills. ###### The ink dilemma, a witty aside. As senators debated the merits of various policies, they often found themselves in a sticky situation, not just with each other, but with their ink. There's an ancient joke that if you wanted to keep a senator from speaking, just hand them a quill and a pot of slow-drying ink. 4. As history shows, the longer it takes for the ink to dry, the longer it takes for the senator to find their voice again. ########. The evolution of ink usage. Throughout the centuries, the Roman Senate adapted its use of ink to meet the demands of an evolving society. By the late Republic, innovations in ink production led to faster drying times and improved writing quality. 1. Late Republic innovations, 1st century BCE. Introduction of iron gall ink, which dried faster and was more durable. This innovation, while it came with its own set of challenges, namely, it could corrode parchment over time, was a game-changer for senators who needed to get their statements recorded before the opposition had a chance to respond. 2. Imperial era changes, 27 BCE, 476 CE. The establishment of state-sponsored workshops for ink production aimed to standardize quality and reduce costs. Senators could now purchase ink at a subsidized rate, no longer needing to empty their coffers for a pint of the good stuff. This led to a proliferation of written documents, some of which were less than thrilling. Think of the equivalent of today's bureaucratic memos. 3. Cultural impact. The rising popularity of formal writing led to a codification of laws and decrees, creating a rich tapestry of legal texts that would influence future generations. Unfortunately, it also meant that senators had to be more careful about their ink usage. A poorly written decree could lead to public embarrassment and a loss of political capital. Conclusion, the legacy of ink drying times. In retrospect, the history of quill ink drying times in the Roman Senate, while seemingly unexciting, encapsulates the complex interplay of politics, technology, and culture in ancient Rome. From the meticulous construction of quills to the bureaucratic rules governing ink usage, each detail paints a picture of a society that valued the written word as both a tool for governance and an instrument of power. So, the next time you encounter a particularly dry historical account, remember that behind every parchment and every ink blot lies a story of senators, scribes, and the eternal struggle to let the ink dry without smudging their reputations. After all, in the arena of Roman politics, it was not just the ink that needed to dry, but the egos of those who wielded the quills. The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. Ah, the Roman Senate. A bastion of political debate, a hotbed of intrigue, and home to more ink than a squid convention. But before you scroll away to watch cat memes, let's dive into the riveting world of Quill ink drying times in the Roman Senate. Yes, you read that right. We're about to explore a topic so thrilling that even the most ardent history buffs might find themselves stifling a yawn. But fear not. With a little irreverent wit and a few surprises, we shall uncover the minutiae that made the Roman Senate a veritable ink-slinging circus. Hashtag a quill in every hand, the regional variations over time. First things first, the quill. The Romans, much like today's hipsters, had a penchant for artisanal writing instruments. Quills made from the feathers of geese, swans, and occasionally ostriches, because who doesn't want a little drama in their ink-drying process, were the preferred tools for senators to record their thoughts, laws, and probably some questionable poetry on the side. Regional variations in quill ink drying times were as common as gladiatorial matches on a Sunday. In Rome, where the climate was temperate and relatively dry, ink dried faster than you could say, "Et tu, brute?" But in the more humid regions of Gaul, senators would often find their ink still wet when the next session began. Imagine trying to pass a crucial law while your quill leaves a smudgy trail across the parchment. Talk about a scandal. As ink drying times varied, so did the ink itself. The Romans, never ones to shy away from experimentation, used various combinations of soot, gum arabic, and even wine, for that extra kick, to create their ink. The result? A delightful concoction that dried faster in Rome but left senators in Gaul pondering the meaning of life while they waited for their ink to dry. Hashtag laws, edicts, and the art of record keeping. Now, let's talk about the business end of the Senate, laws and edicts. The Roman Senate was the birthplace of many a law that shaped Western civilization. But behind every great edict was a quill and a lot of patience. You see, a senator couldn't just scribble down a law and call it a day. No, that would be far too easy. Instead, they had to ensure that the ink was dry before the document was presented to the assembly. Imagine the chaos if a senator accidentally handed over a wet parchment. You'd have senators slipping and sliding like they were in a Roman version of Dancing with the Stars. The process of record-keeping was meticulous. The Senate employed scribes, essentially the original nerds, who would keep track of laws, taxes, and ledgers. These scribes had the delightful task of ensuring that every dot and dash was accounted for, and they had to be extra careful, lest they find themselves in a quagmire of legal disputes. One misplaced letter, and suddenly a law intended to regulate grain prices turned into a mandate for mandatory toga wearing on Tuesdays. In addition to the somber business of governance, the Senate also kept records of taxes, which were a source of both revenue and resentment. Imagine the scene, a senator trying to explain tax increases while simultaneously fanning his parchment to speed up the drying process. And that's why we must raise taxes, folks. Now, if only this ink would dry faster. Hashtag logistics and supply chains, the unsung heroes. Let's not forget the unsung heroes of the ink drying saga, logistics and supply chains. The Romans were masters of infrastructure, building roads and aqueducts that would make modern engineers weep with envy. But when it came to ink, the logistics were, shall we say, a bit sticky. The ink had to be made, transported, and stored. This meant that senators had to keep a close eye on their supplies, lest they find themselves at the mercy of a sudden ink shortage. Picture a senator pacing back and forth, clutching an empty ink pot, while his colleagues roll their eyes and mutter about the impending doom of legislation delays. In a particularly memorable incident, a senator in Hispania ran out of ink during a critical vote on a new tax proposal. In a moment of utter desperation, he resorted to using the juice from crushed olives. The resulting document was a sight to behold, an oily mess that not only took ages to dry but also left a lingering scent of Mediterranean cuisine in the Senate chambers. While the proposal did eventually pass, the ensuing debate over whether it should be dubbed the olive tax or tax on excessive snacking became the stuff of legend. Hashtag record keeping, the dreaded dossier. Now, let's talk specifics, because what's history without some tantalizing tidbits? The Romans were fanatical about record keeping. They had entire departments dedicated to maintaining legal documents, tax records, and other administrative paperwork. Imagine a room filled with scrolls, each one carefully labeled and categorized. It was like a bureaucratic version of Hoarders, Roman edition. These records included everything from property ownership to military conscription. And each record had to be meticulously noted in ink that, you guessed it, needed to be dried before it could be filed away. A senator once tried to submit a document that was still wet, leading to a raucous debate over whether the ink could be considered official. The debate lasted for 3 days, during which time the ink dried, but the senators remained stuck in a quagmire of legalese. Hashtag a surprising, grotesque anecdote, the ink that bled. As promised, it's time to delve into the grotesque. While the history of ink drying times may seem benign, it has its dark corners. One such corner involves a particularly notorious senator, let's call him Senator Gaius, who had a flair for the dramatic and a penchant for theatrics. In a fit of rage during a heated debate over land reforms, Senator Gaius decided to make a statement. He took a quill, dipped it into the ink, and, in a moment of extreme passion, jabbed the quill into his own hand. The ink bled out, staining his toga and creating a scene that would haunt the Senate for generations. Now, you might think this was a moment of sheer madness, but Gaius used it to his advantage. He proclaimed, "If my blood is worth more than this ink, then how can we govern without sacrifice?" The line became legendary, and while it didn't lead to any immediate legislative changes, it did result in a surge of ink sales. After all, who wouldn't want to commemorate such a dramatic event? Hashtag conclusion, a legacy of ink and absurdity. So there you have it, the unexciting yet oddly fascinating history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. From regional variations, laws, and the logistical nightmares of supply chains to the absurdity of record keeping, we've explored the corners of a world that may seem mundane but was anything but. Next time you think of the Roman Senate, don't just envision togas and oratory debates. Picture the ink drying, the quill scratching, and the occasional senator bleeding all over the parchment in a quest for political glory. Because in the end, whether it's ink drying times or political wrangling, the Romans showed us one thing: history may be written in ink, but it's often a messy, chaotic affair. And that, dear reader, is where the real excitement lies. #### The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. Ah, the Roman Senate. A bastion of political discourse, gladiatorial debates, and the occasional flamboyant toga. However, amidst the grandiose speeches and the power plays of the elite, there lies a rather unexciting, yet oddly fascinating topic: the drying times of quill ink. Yes, you read that correctly. While emperors rose and fell, the ink used to record their legacies was having its own existential crisis. ###### Regional variations over time. The Roman Empire was a sprawling beast, stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the sun-drenched sands of North Africa. Just like the distinct regional dialects you might encounter today, hello, y'all, versus, you guys, the drying times of quill ink varied regionally. Who knew that the ink used in Rome would dry faster than that of a provincial outpost in Gaul? The secret? Climate. In the temperate climes of Rome, the ambient humidity and moderate temperatures allowed ink to dry in an acceptable time frame of about 15 minutes, ideal for jotting down edicts about tax increases or the latest scandal involving a senator and a goat. Meanwhile, in the more humid swamps of the Po Valley, ink could take up to an hour to dry. Imagine a senator trying to sign off on a critical law while it's smudged all over his fresh toga. Now that would be a scandal for the ages. As time passed and the empire expanded, the Romans' thirst for ink became as diverse as their cuisine. The variety of inks, made from carbon soot, plant extracts, and yes, even the occasional crushed insect, also contributed to drying times. In the provinces, where resources were scarce, some ingenious locals started using whatever they could find. The result? A delightful concoction that might take 15 minutes to dry in Rome but could also leave you with a permanent stain on your scroll if you weren't careful. ##### Laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. Just as the Senate busily churned out laws and edicts with the fervor of a teenager cramming for finals, the process of record-keeping was a meticulous affair. Every piece of legislation had to be inked, dried, and properly filed away in ledgers that would eventually become the bane of every senator's existence. Let's paint a picture. It's 59 BC, and you're a senator. You've just drafted a law imposing a new tax on the fine citizens of Rome, because who doesn't love a good tax hike? You carefully dip your quill in the ink made from the finest carbon soot, no, not your local blacksmith's leftovers, and write out your edict. But that quill ink needs time to dry. And while you're waiting, you can't just sit around twiddling your thumbs. No, there are important matters to attend to, like gossiping about that senator who always seems to have fresh laurel leaves in his hair or debating the merits of imported wine versus local plunk. Once the ink is dry, the real fun begins. You'll need to have an attendant ready with a wax tablet to record the tax details, and, if you're particularly organized, a backup scroll to ensure that no detail is lost to the whims of fate, or a particularly nasty ink spill. This was all part of a grand tradition of bureaucracy that, frankly, would make even the most seasoned modern accountant weep with joy, or despair. Hashtag 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 logistics and supply chains. Now, let's talk about logistics, shall we? The Roman Empire was a marvel of engineering and organization, but when it came to ink supply chains, it was a bit like a game of pass the parcel, except everyone was trying to sell the parcel, and if you didn't have enough ink, you were probably in deep trouble. Here's the kicker: ink was not just a commodity, it was a status symbol. Senators wanted the best ink money could buy, which meant sourcing it from various regions. Think of it as the ancient equivalent of artisanal ink shops. The logistics behind procuring the right materials were a nightmare even for the most seasoned trader. The best quills came from the feathers of geese that grazed in the lush grasslands of Gaul, while the most sought-after inks were made from ingredients harvested during specific lunar phases. And if you happen to run out of ink while drafting a critical law, good luck explaining that to the emperor. To ensure that every senator had a quill and ink at their disposal, an intricate web of supply chains crisscrossed the empire. The Romans were early adopters of logistics management, employing everything from cargo ships to ox carts to transport their precious supplies. Picture a bustling Roman port, filled with traders shouting about the latest ink mixes, while the scent of fresh quills wafts through the air. It was a veritable bazaar of ink, feathers, and bureaucratic ambition. Hashtag 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 record keeping with lots of specifics. Record keeping in ancient Rome was about as complex as trying to follow a soap opera plot, full of twists, turns, and the occasional betrayal. When it came to the drying times of ink, the Senate had to maintain meticulous records, lest someone accidentally sign off on a bill that could lead to another great tax uprising. Each senator had their own method for keeping track of these drying times. Some used simple charts, while others preferred a more artistic approach, sketching images of quills and ink bottles alongside the drying times, because, why not make bureaucracy a little more aesthetically pleasing? If you were particularly clever, you might even invent a mnemonic device to remember the drying times by associating them with famous battles or the names of your enemies. Remember, it takes 30 minutes for ink from the East, but an hour for that nonsense from Gaul. The records themselves were often kept on wax tablets or parchment, which meant that if you were prone to spills, you might end up with a rather messy document. Imagine a senator pulling out his scroll to announce a new law, only to have it smudged beyond recognition, effectively turning tax on imported wine into tax on imported wine. Hashtag 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 one surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. As riveting as the history of quill ink drying times is, it wouldn't be complete without a bizarre anecdote that would make even the most seasoned historian cringe. Picture this: a senator, eager to make a statement, decides to unveil a new decree regarding public sanitation. Yes, even in ancient Rome, sanitation was an issue. In a fit of enthusiasm, he dips his quill into the finest ink and, in a moment of sheer folly, leans in too close to the inkwell. The quill slips, and a splash of ink lands right on his toga, which, for the fashion-conscious senator, was equivalent to wearing a neon sign that read, "I have no idea what I'm doing." But wait. It gets worse. In an attempt to salvage his dignity, he reaches for the nearest wax tablet to make a note of the incident. Unfortunately, the tablet was still warm from the sun. Turns out, wax tablets have a melting point, much like that of your favorite chocolate. So there he is, trying to draft a law while simultaneously battling the creeping horror of his melting tablet, which is now dripping ink onto the floor, creating a gruesome little puddle of chaos. And what does this senator do? He decides to carry on. A true Roman, he stands up, ink-stained and wax-dripped, and delivers his speech with all the pomp and circumstance of a man who has just realized he's lost his last clean toga to the whims of fate and a quill. In the end, the law passed, but it became known as the Sanitation Edict of the Inky Toga, a notorious reminder of how one man's mishap with quill ink led to a very public moment of embarrassment. ###conclusion. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. It's a saga filled with regional variations, bureaucratic chaos, and one particularly grotesque anecdote that proves that even in the grand halls of power, the mundane can quickly turn into the absurd. As we reflect on this ancient history, let's take a moment to appreciate the unsung heroes of the Roman Empire, not the emperors or the generals, but the humble quills and the ink they bore, forever drying in the shadows of history. And who knows? Perhaps the next time you dip your pen in ink, you'll think of those senators, valiantly waiting for their ink to dry while pondering the eternal questions of taxation, governance, and the occasional goat. The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. Once upon a time, in the grand and illustrious halls of the Roman Senate, where togas billowed like sails and oratory flourished like weeds in a neglected garden, there was a most mundane concern that plagued the minds of senators, the drying time of quill ink. Now, you might be thinking that this sounds like the dullest topic imaginable, and you'd be absolutely correct. But, dear reader, bear with me as we navigate the undulating plains of bureaucracy, ink, and the occasional grotesque anecdote that will linger in your mind like a bad smell. ###regional variations over time. Let's set the scene. It's 27 BCE, and Julius Caesar has just declared himself dictator for life. How original. In the midst of political upheaval and power grabs, you might imagine that the drying time of ink was the least of their worries. But oh, how wrong you would be. As the Roman Empire sprawled across Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia, the drying times of quill ink became a matter of regional pride and bureaucratic necessity. In the humid climes of Gaul, it was said that ink took longer to dry, leading to many a smudged ledger and frantic apologies to the gods of record-keeping. Meanwhile, the arid deserts of Egypt boasted lightning-fast drying times, which led to the hasty scribbling of laws and edicts that often resulted in administrative chaos. Imagine a senator in Alexandria, furiously writing down a new tax law, only to have it dry so quickly that he accidentally left out a zero. Oops, My bad. Instead of a tax on wine, I meant a tax on water. Who's thirsty? The variances in drying time could also be attributed to the ink itself, which was often made from a slurry of soot, gum, and various plant extracts that could have easily doubled as a salad dressing if you were feeling particularly adventurous. Regional ink recipes led to differences in viscosity and drying speeds, making the quill a veritable paintbrush of bureaucratic doom. The Romans were nothing if not resourceful, and a little bit mad, leading to a veritable cornucopia of ink concoctions that would make any modern-day hipster swoon. ##### laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. Now, let's talk about the fun stuff, laws and taxes. Those delightful constructs of human society that keep us all in line, like a bunch of well-behaved sheep. The Roman Senate was notorious for its insatiable thirst for new laws and taxes, often to fund their lavish lifestyles and military campaigns. And you guessed it, every time a new law was drafted, the drying time of quill ink became a focal point of discussion. Imagine a senator standing up, toga perfectly draped, quill poised dramatically in hand. My esteemed colleagues, as I present this edict to increase the tax on olive oil, I must first consider the drying time of our finest ink. For if it smudges, we risk inciting the wrath of the people, and no one wants to deal with a mob of disgruntled olive oil producers. The Senate chambers would echo with sighs and murmurs of agreement, as they all understood the gravity of the situation. The ink would dry, laws would be passed, and yet somewhere in the background, a few senators would be whispering about the latest gossip, oblivious to the urgency of ink drying times. #### logistics and supply chains. Now, let's take a moment to discuss logistics and supply chains because, believe it or not, the Roman Empire was a marvel of organization. Imagine the bustling marketplaces of Rome, where merchants hawked their wares and scribes frantically jotted down orders for ink, quills, and parchment. The logistics of supplying the Senate with adequate ink supplies was no small feat, and drying times played a crucial role in determining how quickly business could be conducted. As the empire expanded, so did the network of ink suppliers. In Rome, you had your local merchants selling a mix of high-quality ink and dubious concoctions that might as well have been made from old olive pits. And in the provinces, more exotic ingredients were often used, leading to a veritable melting pot of ink styles and drying times. But here's where it gets interesting. The Romans didn't just slap their ink on parchment and call it a day. They had a system. A glorious, bureaucratic, time-consuming system. Senators would often send out messengers to gauge the drying times based on regional variations, thus creating a convoluted web of ink logistics that would make even the most sophisticated modern supply chain look like a child's finger painting. With every new edict, there was a flurry of activity to ensure that the ink was delivered on time, dried to perfection, and ready for approval. Imagine a poor scribe running around the forum, ink-stained fingers flapping like a distressed bird, trying to keep up with the demands of an impatient Senate. I swear, the ink was just delivered from Gaul. How long does it take to dry? #### record keeping with lots of specifics. Speaking of those poor scribes, let's move on to the fine art of record keeping, because what's more exhilarating than meticulously documenting the drying times of quill ink? You might think that this is a trivial matter, but in the Roman Senate, record-keeping was an Olympic sport. The Senate had entire departments dedicated to tracking laws, taxes, and yes, even quill ink drying times. Every senatorial decree was documented in ledgers, which were then passed around for approval. Each entry had to be precise. No one wanted a record that said, ink drying time, 10 minutes, give or take a millennium. Instead, it was written with the same fervor as a love letter. On the Ides of March, it was recorded that the ink dried in precisely 8 minutes and 32 seconds, leading to the swift passage of the Edict of Taxation on fish sauce. These ledgers were bound in leather and decorated with intricate designs, some even adorned with images of quills and ink pots, artistry for the ages. But imagine the horror of a scribe who miscalculated the drying time. Oops, it looks like instead of a 5% tax increase, we accidentally enacted a 50% one. Good luck explaining that to the citizens. #### one surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, what would a history of quill ink drying times be without a little anecdote to spice things up? Let me introduce you to Lucius, a lesser-known senator with a penchant for dramatic flair and an unfortunate allergy to certain inks. Legend has it that Lucius was known for his vivid speeches, which would often leave his colleagues in rapturous applause or mild confusion, depending on the day. One fateful day, Lucius decided it was time to introduce a new law regarding the regulation of fish sauce production, an important industry in Rome. He stood before the Senate, quill in hand, ready to unveil his magnum opus. However, in his excitement, he accidentally dipped his quill into a batch of hastily mixed ink that was still drying. As he began to write, the ink remained wet for an inordinate amount of time, a veritable ink fountain of chaos. In his fervor, Lucius leaned in closer, only to have the ink splatter all over his toga and, more alarmingly, into his mouth. In the midst of his passionate discourse, he suddenly began to choke, spluttering and gasping for air, all while his colleagues watched in horror. The fish sauce must be regulated, he proclaimed between coughs, looking like a dying fish himself. The Senate erupted in laughter, with many believing it was a clever ruse to distract from the absurdity of the law he was proposing. Lucius became a legend, not for his eloquence or his grasp of legislation, but for that one fateful day when ink and ambition collided in a most grotesque performance art piece. ###conclusion. And so, we arrive at the end of our exploration into the thrilling, heart-pounding world of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. Who would have thought that such a seemingly trivial detail could encompass regional variations, laws, logistics, and even a sprinkle of grotesque humor? The next time you sit down to write, take a moment to appreciate the art of ink drying, lest you find yourself in a similarly hilarious predicament as our friend Lucius. In the grand tapestry of history, let us not forget the unsung heroes, the scribes, the senators, and the suppliers of ink, who toiled away to ensure that every smudge and drying time was meticulously recorded. For in the annals of history, even the most unexciting details deserve their moment in the sun, or at least a good laugh. The Unexciting History of Roman Senate Quill Ink Drying Times, a not-so-serious scribble. Welcome, dear reader, to a voyage through the far less glamorous side of ancient Rome. Forget about gladiators, chariot races, and scandalous affairs. We're diving headfirst into the world of quill ink drying times in the Roman Senate. You may be wondering how this topic, seemingly as thrilling as watching paint dry, could possibly hold your attention. But worry not. I promise you a veritable feast of fun facts, regional variations, and a bizarre anecdote that'll make you squirm just a little. Put on your togas and let's get rolling. Hashtag regional variations over time. First, let's set the stage. The Roman Empire was vast, sprawling from the windswept moors of Britain to the sun-drenched shores of North Africa. With this geographical expanse came a cornucopia of ink recipes and drying times that would make any modern bureaucrat weep with envy. You see, while the Senate was debating the finer points of governance, scribes were hard at work making sure those debates were recorded with the utmost precision, unless, of course, they were too busy trying to figure out which ink dried fastest in the sweltering heat of Egypt or the dampness of Gaul. The Romans had a distinct preference for carbon-based inks, which were all the rage. However, depending on the region, you might find some interesting variations. In Egypt, for instance, the ink was often mixed with a bit of gum arabic to give it a glossy sheen. Unfortunately, this glossy sheen came at a price, namely, prolonged drying times. Imagine a senator tapping his foot impatiently, waiting for his latest decree to dry as he absent-mindedly contemplates the state of his toga. Meanwhile, in Gaul, the moisture-laden air would leave ink more susceptible to smudging, requiring a quicker application of quill strokes. The Gauls had to be quick, after all. Who wants to be blamed for a smudged decree when the local warlord could come knocking at any moment? Hashtag laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. Now, let's talk business. The Roman Senate was the heartbeat of governance, responsible for laws, edicts, and taxes that would make even the most seasoned accountant's head spin. Picture this, a group of senators huddled around a table, quills poised, ready to draft the next great law for the empire. The ink was flowing, but oh, those drying times. With each stroke of the quill, the weight of history rested on their shoulders, along with the knowledge that a single smudge could lead to a taxation debacle that would have the plebeians at their doors with torches and pitchforks. The Romans were meticulous when it came to record-keeping. They had ledgers for everything, taxes collected, soldiers enlisted, even the number of olive trees in a senator's estate. The drying time of ink was crucial. A smudge on a tax ledger could mean a miscalculation that left the treasury slightly lighter than expected. Can you imagine the panic? Oh no! We thought we had 100 denarii, but now it says 10. Quick, someone find a scribe with a faster drying ink. Hashtag logistics and supply chains. Ah, logistics, the unsung hero of the Roman Empire. While Julius Caesar was busy crossing the Rubicon and planting flags in distant lands, someone had to ensure that quills and ink supplies reached the Senate in tip-top shape. The logistics of ink delivery was a complex business. You didn't want to run out of ink during a crucial debate, unless you fancied yourself a senator with a sudden case of writer's block. In Rome, ink was produced in various workshops, each with its own secret recipe. Some were known for their deep blacks, while others specialized in vibrant reds that were perfect for highlighting important decrees. As the empire expanded, so did the supply chains that brought these precious resources to the heart of governance. Imagine a bustling marketplace, with merchants shouting about the latest ink innovations, while senators in the background fervently debate the merits of quicker-drying inks versus the beauty of the classic carbon mix. And let's not forget the role of the Roman roads, which were the envy of the world. These thoroughfares weren't just for soldiers and traders, they were the arteries through which ink flowed. Picture a cart filled with ink pots bouncing along, jostling precariously as it navigated the cobblestone streets of Rome, while a hapless scribe clutches his quill, praying for a smooth delivery. #### record keeping with lots of specifics. Now, if you thought that the logistics of ink supply was fascinating, wait until you hear about the actual record-keeping practices of the Senate. The Romans were sticklers for details, and their record-keeping was as precise as a sundial. You could almost hear the senators murmur, "A day without proper ink is a day wasted." Every law passed, every tax levied, and every edict issued needed to be meticulously documented. Senators would often employ a team of scribes, each with their own quill, ink, and parchment, to ensure that no detail was overlooked. These scribes had an unspoken hierarchy. Those who could write swiftly enough to keep up with the senators were the crème de la crème of the scribe world. The stakes were high. A missed detail could lead to a misinterpretation of the law or, worse yet, a delayed payment to the military. But it wasn't just about speed, legibility was key. Imagine a scribe, sweating bullets as he tries to keep pace with a senator's rapid-fire speech. "We must ensure the consolidation of the tax on olives, and don't forget the smudge." Aghast, the scribe realizes that his quill has betrayed him, leaving a blotch that transforms olives into lives. What a pickle! "No, no, Senator. I meant the tax on olives, not a declaration of war on lives." One surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. And now we arrive at the piece de resistance of our journey, the anecdote that will leave you both horrified and amused. Picture this: it's a hot day in ancient Rome, and the Senate is in session, the air thick with the tension of political debate. As the senators discuss the merits of a new tax on fish, a scribe in the corner suddenly realizes he's run out of ink. Panicking, he looks around, desperately searching for a solution. In a moment of sheer desperation, he remembers the old wives' tale that suggested using his own urine as a makeshift ink. Yes, you read that correctly, urine. It turns out that the ammonia in urine could create a rudimentary ink. So, in a fit of panic, this scribe dashed outside, did what he had to do, and returned with a small vial of his newfound ink. As he dipped his quill into the makeshift mixture, a senator caught sight of him and shouted, "What in Jupiter's name are you doing?" To which the scribe, with a mixture of pride and shame, replied, "Just trying to make sure the decrees are properly recorded, Senator." You know how it goes, when ink is low, one must go low. The senators were left in utter shock, unsure whether to laugh or gag. And that, dear reader, is how a small mishap in the annals of Roman history turned into an unforgettable moment of comedy, reminding us all that even in the highest echelons of power, sometimes you just have to roll with the punches, or in this case, the urine. #### conclusion, a dry topic with a splash of humor. So there you have it, a rollicking romp through the unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. From the regional variations that kept scribes on their toes to the logistics of ink supply chains and the meticulous record-keeping that ensured Rome's governance ran smoothly, we've covered a lot of ground. And let's not forget that bizarre anecdote that will surely haunt your dreams, a scribe's desperate attempt to ensure that history was recorded, one way or another. It's a reminder that while the quill may be mightier than the sword, sometimes it's just best to keep things flowing, lest you find yourself in a rather sticky situation. So, the next time you dip your pen into ink, remember the trials and tribulations of those ancient scribes. They might not have had the luxury of quick-drying ink, but they certainly knew how to make history entertaining, one smudge at a time. The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times, a journey through the ages. If you think the history of the Roman Senate is just a series of power struggles, orators making grand speeches, and the occasional stabbing for good measure, think again. Today, dear reader, we're diving into the less glamorous but equally fascinating world of quill ink drying times, a topic that may very well make you question your life choices. So grab a goblet of watered-down wine, settle in, and prepare to be mildly amused as we explore the regional variations, laws, logistics, and a surprisingly grotesque anecdote that you'll wish you could unlearn. #### regional variations over time. Let's start with the fact that the Roman Empire was as vast and diverse as a buffet at a family reunion. There were all sorts of regional quirks, and ink drying times were no exception. In the balmy coastal regions of Italy, the warm Mediterranean breeze was a quill's best friend. In the heat of summer, the drying time could be as short as a chariot race. The ink would dry faster than you could say, "Et tu, brute." However, head just a few hundred miles north to the chilly provinces of Gaul, and you might as well have been trying to dry your ink in a refrigerator. There, quill ink would take its sweet time, often leaving senators twiddling their thumbs, wondering if they should start a new hobby or perhaps just write a sonnet about their ink frustrations. As the seasons changed, so did the ink. In winter, ink would behave like a moody Roman senator, slow and sluggish, refusing to dry at all. Just imagine a senator furiously scribbling down the latest tax edict while shivering in a drafty chamber. With every passing moment, the ink would smudge more dramatically than a political scandal, rendering any record-keeping efforts utterly futile. It's no wonder that many a senator lost his patience and simply decided to take a day off, claiming urgent matters required his attention. #### laws, edicts, and taxes, the ink that binds. Now, let's talk about the laws, edicts, and taxes that the Roman Senate was so fond of producing. Much like your average tax form today, these documents had to be meticulously recorded, and ink drying times played a surprisingly critical role in the bureaucratic machinery of Rome. Picture this: a senator stands up, clears his throat, and reads out a new tax law. The audience listens with bated breath, but the ink is still wet and smudging on the scroll. Ah, the horror! The very foundation of Roman fiscal policy could be compromised by a rogue draft. In fact, one of the most famous tax laws, the Lex Julia, was nearly derailed by ink drying times. As the senators debated the finer points of taxation, they frantically scribbled notes, only for the ink to smear on the parchment. This led to an entire afternoon of confusion where the senators were convinced that they had accidentally decreed a tax on goat cheese instead of a tax on property. The resulting chaos could have rivaled a gladiatorial match, as senators wrestled with the implications of their potential goat cheese tax. This little hiccup in ink management was a stark reminder that even the mightiest empire could be brought to its knees by a mere quill and some wet ink. #### logistics and supply chains, the ink that runs the empire. Just like today, logistics were crucial for the Romans, especially regarding their beloved ink supply. The Roman Empire had an intricate network of suppliers who provided everything from quills to ink. However, tracking down the best ink could be like finding a needle in a haystack. You see, not all inks were created equal, and senators had their preferences. Some preferred ink made from soot, while others swore by a blend of vegetable dyes and a secret ingredient, possibly the tears of conquered foes. The supply chains were as convoluted as a Senate debate, and any hiccup could spell disaster. In one particularly amusing incident, a shipment of ink intended for the Senate was sent to a local tavern instead. The tavern keeper, thinking it was an exotic new brew, decided to serve it alongside his finest vintage. Senators who had come to quench their thirst for knowledge, and perhaps a bit of wine, instead found themselves sipping on what they believed to be a new ink. The result? A group of slightly tipsy senators, convinced that they had discovered the secret to more eloquent speeches, resulting in a series of laws that made absolutely no sense. Let it be known henceforth that all citizens must wear purple hats on Wednesdays. They were probably just trying to be fashionable but ended up looking ridiculous. #### record keeping, the devil is in the details. When it came to record keeping, the Roman Senate was like the ultimate overachiever in the class who just couldn't let go. Their meticulous documentation required not only perfectly dried ink but also a plethora of parchment and quills. With every new law, there needed to be a copy for the archives, a copy for the public, and of course, a copy for the ever-watchful eyes of the emperor. But here's the kicker: the ink didn't just dry at different rates based on the weather or location, it could also dry at different rates based on the type of parchment used. Calfskin, for instance, was all the rage, but it was more temperamental than a diva at a concert. If the parchment wasn't prepared correctly, the ink might take forever to dry or, worse, soak into the surface like an unwanted rumor. The senators had to be on their A-game, ensuring every detail was just right. One can only imagine the scene: a senator stands at the front, quill in hand, as he reads out the latest law. By the power vested in me, I decree that, and then he pauses, horrified to discover that his quill has left a giant ink blot on the parchment. This wasn't just any ink blot, it was a calamity of epic proportions. The audience gasps, and the senator turns crimson. Ah, yes. A new law on ink blotting. It shall henceforth be illegal. Cue the laughter, or at least eye rolls, as the ink blot became a running joke. Hashtag a surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, for the piece de resistance, the borderline grotesque anecdote that you'll either find incredibly amusing or utterly revolting. Legend has it that one particularly ambitious senator, eager to make his mark, pun intended, on history, decided to concoct his own ink at home. He mixed soot with a special ingredient, bat guano. Yes, you read that correctly. Bat poop was considered an enhancer of sorts, purportedly giving the ink richer color and improved drying times. As fate would have it, the senator decided to unveil his new ink during a crucial Senate meeting. He boldly declared, "Behold, the future of ink." Only to discover that while it might have looked magnificent on the parchment, the smell was reminiscent of a particularly unkempt stable. As senators began to gag and fan their noses, one brave soul stood up and proclaimed, "I propose a law against the use of guano in ink. For the love of all that is holy." From that day forward, the senator was forever known as the guano guy, and his ambitious plans for ink innovation crumbled faster than a poorly dried scroll. Hashtag conclusion, the inky legacy of Rome. So there you have it, the unexciting yet strangely captivating history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. The trials and tribulations of ink management might not have the same dramatic flair as a political assassination, but they certainly paint a vivid picture of the everyday struggles of Roman senators. From regional variations and logistical nightmares to laws that could be derailed by a mere ink blot, it's clear that the world of ink was far more complex than one might initially think. Next time you dip your quill into ink, spare a thought for those ancient senators who grappled with the very same issues, albeit with a flair for the absurd. After all, whether it's the ink drying or a passionate debate on goat cheese taxes, history has a way of reminding us that even the most serious of subjects can have a touch of the ridiculous. So raise your goblet to the ink, the quills, and the senators who dared to scribble their way into history, one smudged edict at a time. The unexciting history of Roman Senate quill ink drying times. In the grand tapestry of ancient Rome, one might expect that tales of grand battles, political intrigue, and monumental architecture would dominate the narratives. However, nestled among these iconic events lies a surprisingly mundane yet oddly fascinating aspect of Roman governance, the drying times of quill ink used in the Senate. While seemingly trivial, this detail provides a unique lens through which we can understand the intricacies of Roman bureaucracy, the daily lives of senators, and the broader context of communication in the ancient world. Minor figures and petty rules. To set the stage, let us first consider the minor figures who populated the Roman Senate. While names like Cicero, Caesar, and Augustus often dominate historical discussions, countless lesser-known senators played crucial roles in the day-to-day operations of governance. Take, for instance, Gaius Furius, who in 63 BCE proposed a seemingly innocuous rule regarding ink drying times. His proposal arose after a particularly heated debate in which several senators' hastily written notes smudged, leading to confusion and miscommunication. Furius suggested a standardized allowance of 5 minutes for ink drying before documents could be passed along. This seemingly minute regulation sparked a series of discussions that would ripple through the Senate for decades. Furius was not alone in his obsession with the minutiae of Senate rules. His colleague, Marcus Tullius Cicero, often lamented the inefficiencies of the Senate, remarking, "When I am forced to wait for ink to dry, I ponder the weight of the Republic upon my shoulders." Cicero's wit illustrates that even in the face of pressing political issues, the practicalities of ink drying could not be overlooked. In fact, the Senate adopted a policy whereby all official documents must be left undisturbed for a minimum of 5 minutes post-ink application to ensure legibility and prevent smudging. In 49 BCE, during a particularly tumultuous period in Roman history, the drying times of ink took on a new significance. As tensions mounted between Julius Caesar and Pompey, a senator from the Optimate faction, Lucius Marcius, proposed an amendment to the ink-drying rule. He argued that with the threat of civil war looming, the Senate should reduce the drying time to 3 minutes to expedite communication. His proposal, however, was met with fierce opposition from more traditional senators who believed that haste undermined the gravitas of their communications. The debate lasted for hours, showcasing how even the most mundane details could become points of contention in a politically charged atmosphere. Case studies with dates and lists. To delve deeper into the history of ink drying times, we can examine several case studies that highlight various proposals and their implications. 1. The Furius Proposal, 63 BCE. Gaius Furius's proposal for a 5-minute drying time leads to the establishment of a formal rule. This proposal is recorded in the Senate's archives and remains a footnote in the long history of Roman governance. 2. The Marcius Amendment, 49 BCE. Lucius Marcius's push for a reduction in drying time sparked a debate that lasted for 3 days. Ultimately, the Senate voted against the amendment, maintaining the 5-minute rule. The debate featured notable senators, including Cicero and Cato the Younger, who argued passionately on both sides. 3. The Smudge Incident, 45 BCE. During a session where critical legislation was being discussed, a senator's ink smudged due to insufficient drying time, leading to a misinterpretation of a key proposal. This incident was later referred to as the smudge incident, and it galvanized support for a more rigorous adherence to ink drying regulations. 4. The Sulla Doctrine, 82 BCE. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a notable dictator, issued a decree that all Senate communications must be written using a specific type of ink known for its quicker drying properties. This decree led to a temporary spike in the use of a special type of carbon-based ink made from soot and resin, which dried within 2 minutes. 5. The Cicero Reforms, 44 BCE. In the wake of Caesar's assassination, Cicero proposed a series of reforms to streamline Senate operations, including reaffirming the 5-minute drying rule but introducing new parchment that allowed quicker drying. His reforms aimed to modernize the Senate's communication methods, although they were often met with resistance from traditionalists. These case studies provide a glimpse into the trials, tribulations, and ultimately, the absurdities that surrounded a seemingly minor issue. Each incident reveals how deeply intertwined the mundane aspects of governance were with the larger political narrative of Rome. Comparisons to other regions. While the Roman Senate grappled with the complexities of ink drying, it is worth considering how other ancient civilizations approached similar issues. In ancient Greece, for instance, the use of reed pens and ink made from soot and water was common. However, the Greeks placed less emphasis on drying times and more on the aesthetics of the written word. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle often wrote lengthy treatises that were less concerned with immediate dissemination and more focused on the art of rhetoric and philosophy. In contrast, the Chinese were centuries ahead in their understanding of ink and writing materials. By the Han Dynasty, 206 BCE, 220 CE, Chinese scholars had developed a variety of inks that dried quickly and were resistant to smudging, allowing for efficient record-keeping and communication. This technological advancement placed Chinese bureaucracy on a different trajectory, enabling a more streamlined governmental process compared to the sometimes laborious methods employed by the Romans. Moreover, the Mesopotamians utilized clay tablets and cuneiform writing, which required a different approach entirely. Once inscribed, the tablets needed to be baked to harden the clay, making the question of ink drying times irrelevant. In this context, the Romans' concerns about ink drying seem quaint, if not altogether peculiar. Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological finds have also contributed to our understanding of Roman ink drying practices. In 1947, archaeologists unearthed a trove of papyrus scrolls near the ruins of Pompeii that contained extensive writings about governance, including several references to ink drying times. One scroll, dated to 79 CE, included a list of recommended inks, their drying times, and the types of quills most suitable for each ink type. This discovery shed light on the practical challenges faced by senators and scribes alike. Additionally, inscriptions on stone tablets have revealed evidence of public notices that were likely written under the constraints of drying ink. The careful spacing and organization of letters suggest that the writers were acutely aware of the need for legibility, further emphasizing the importance of drying times in the ancient world. In 2016, a discovery at the site of Ostia Antica revealed remnants of an ancient ink workshop. Tools and materials used for ink production were found alongside detailed records of ink properties, which included drying times. These finds provide tangible evidence of the meticulous care that went into the creation of ink and the subsequent writing process. Two rhetorical questions that hook curiosity. As we contemplate this unexciting yet intriguing aspect of Roman history, one cannot help but wonder, how much of our contemporary understanding of government and bureaucracy has been shaped by the seemingly trivial details of ink and parchment? And, in a world dominated by digital communication, what lessons can we glean from the ancient practice of ensuring that ink dried before the weight of history was etched upon the pages? In conclusion, the drying times of quill ink in the Roman Senate may appear to be an unremarkable footnote in the annals of history, yet it serves as a reminder of the complexities of governance and communication in the ancient world. Through minor figures, petty rules, and the occasional smudge, we can glean insights into the lives of those who shaped Rome and, by extension, much of Western civilization. In the grand scheme of history, perhaps it is the mundane details that tell us the most about the people and cultures that came before us. The Unexciting History of Roman Senate Quill Ink Drying Times. The Roman Senate, a bastion of democracy and governance, often conjures images of grand debates, toga-clad senators, and monumental decisions that shape the course of history. However, behind the grandeur lies a rather tedious aspect that has often been overlooked: the drying times of quill ink used by these esteemed senators. While the world remembers the bold decisions made under the marble columns of the Curia, it is the minor figures, petty rules, and the minutiae of ink drying times that provide a fascinating, albeit unexciting, lens into Roman governance. Minor figures and petty rules. To truly appreciate the quill ink drying times in the Roman Senate, one must first consider the minor figures who played pivotal roles in the day-to-day operations of the Senate. Among them was the scriba, a clerk responsible for recording the Senate's proceedings. While senators debated the fate of provinces or the allocation of troops, the scribae were preoccupied with the nuances of ink application and drying, ensuring that documents were legible and preserved for posterity. The lex scribana, a little-known rule established in 230 BCE, mandated that quill ink used in official records must dry within a 2-hour period. The rationale was to prevent smudging and ensure that the records remained reliable. However, this rule led to disputes among senators regarding the quality of ink and the types of quills used. Some senators argued for the use of cinnamomum ink, derived from the bark of cinnamon trees, which dried quickly but often faded over time. Others preferred sanguis draconis, a resin that dried slowly but offered richer color and durability. This debate over ink types highlighted the minor yet passionate disputes that characterized Senate discussions. Case studies with dates and lists. Examining specific cases offers insight into how ink drying times influenced the Senate's operations. On March 15, 44 BCE, the infamous day of Julius Caesar's assassination, a Senate meeting was convened to discuss his growing power. As the senators prepared their parchments for the debate, a peculiar incident occurred involving the ink. Due to an unseasonable rain that day, the humidity levels spiked, causing the ink to dry slowly. This led to a delay in the recording of the proceedings and resulted in a series of hastily scribbled notes that later became the subject of scrutiny. A few key dates stand out regarding ink drying times in the Senate. 1. April 4, 59 BCE, a debate over the lex sigana, the law regarding the regulation of ink production, highlighted the importance of drying time. Senators presented a range of ink samples, with drying times varying from 30 minutes to 2 hours. 2. February 20, 33 BCE, a significant ruling on the use of atramentum, black ink, was made after a senator's notes smudged during a critical vote, prompting a call for standardized ink quality. 3. June 1, 17 CE, the Senate passed a resolution mandating an official review of ink drying times, leading to the establishment of the Commission on Ink Standards, which published its findings on the optimal drying times based on environmental conditions. These case studies reveal the seemingly trivial yet impactful nature of ink drying times and the functioning of the Senate, reminding us that even the smallest details can have far-reaching consequences. Comparisons to other regions. In comparison to other ancient civilizations, the Roman Senate's meticulous attention to ink drying times appears almost obsessive. For instance, in ancient Greece, the agora was bustling with debate and discussion, but the Greeks showed a laissez-faire attitude towards ink usage. Their preference for ink derived from the walnut tree resulted in a thicker consistency that was less prone to smudging but took considerably longer to dry. This caused many Greek orators to simply memorize their speeches rather than rely on written documents. In contrast, the Chinese civilization developed a sophisticated system of ink production that included the use of soot from pine trees mixed with animal glue. The drying times for this ink were remarkably quick, allowing for the rapid production of texts. By 200 CE, Chinese scholars had already begun to experiment with different drying techniques, employing the sun's heat, which contrasted with the more static approach of the Romans. Furthermore, in Mesopotamia, clay tablets were the medium of choice, negating the issue of ink drying altogether. The Sumerians and Akkadians would inscribe their texts into wet clay, which would then dry naturally in the sun. The permanence of these records stood in stark contrast to the Romans' reliance on ink, which was susceptible to the whims of the environment. Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological finds have added layers of depth to our understanding of Roman ink usage. In 2008, archaeologists uncovered a trove of ancient writing instruments in Pompeii, including quills and ink pots. Analysis of the remnants revealed that the Romans had developed specific quill types based on the bird species, with geese quills being the most favored for their flexibility and ink-holding capacity. Interestingly, the study of these artifacts indicated that quills were often dried in controlled environments, suggesting a sophisticated understanding of how drying conditions affected ink viscosity. Additionally, fragments of papyrus from the Egyptian region, dating back to 100 CE, featured notations regarding ink drying times. These fragments indicated that Roman scribes would often measure drying times using a primitive timer constructed from water clocks. The precision of these methods underscores the value placed on legibility and the integrity of the written word. One notable find in the ruins of Herculaneum included an ink recipe inscribed on a piece of parchment, detailing the proportions of various ingredients required for optimal drying time. This recipe, believed to have belonged to a prominent senator, highlights the lengths to which individuals would go to ensure the quality of their written records. 2 rhetorical questions to hook curiosity. 1. How many historical decisions, pivotal to the fate of Rome, may have hinged on the seemingly mundane issue of ink drying times? 2. What minor figures and petty rules have been lost to history, overshadowed by the grand narratives of power and politics? The inquiry into Roman ink drying times, while seemingly trivial, opens a window into the complexities of governance, the interplay of minor figures, and the intricate web of rules that govern daily life in the Senate. As one contemplates the impact of ink drying times on the affairs of the state, it becomes evident that even the smallest details can wield power far beyond their immediate context. In a world that often prioritizes the grandiose and the dramatic, the story of Roman Senate Quill ink drying time serves as a reminder that history is often crafted in the quiet moments of uncertainty, waiting for the ink to dry. The unexciting history of Roman Senate Quill ink drying times. When one thinks of the Roman Senate, grand oratory, fierce debates, and monumental decisions about the fate of empires typically come to mind. However, behind the polished marble columns and the eloquent speeches, there lies a rather mundane yet fascinating aspect of Roman bureaucracy, the drying times of quill ink. Though it seems trivial, the minutiae of ink drying times reveal much about the practices and peculiarities of Roman governance and its minor figures who contributed to the grand narrative of history. Minor figures and petty rules. While Cicero and Caesar dominate the annals of Roman history, one must not overlook the lesser-known clerks and scribes whose lives revolved around the precise measurements of ink and quill. These anonymous figures, often relegated to the background, were crucial in ensuring that the Senate's decisions were accurately recorded. The process of writing with quill and ink was not merely an art, it was a science that required strict adherence to various rules about ink application, drying time, and parchment quality. The Roman Senate had unwritten rules that governed not only the composition of decrees but also the manner in which they were penned. For instance, it was deemed inappropriate for a senator to touch the parchment until the ink had dried completely. Those who dared to do so risked smudging the ink, which could lead to misinterpretations of important decisions. Such faux pas could result in a reprimand from the more senior senators, or worse, a loss of credibility in the eyes of their peers. The drying time of ink was often a topic of heated debate among scribes, leading to a variety of opinions about what constituted an acceptable amount of time. Some argued for a conservative approach, allowing as much as 10 minutes for ink to dry. Others, eager to expedite the governmental process, suggested a mere 5 minutes. Case studies with dates and lists. To illustrate the significance of ink drying times in the Roman Senate, we can look at several case studies from key periods in Roman history. 1. The Lex Licinius Sextia, 367 BCE, this law, which was pivotal in opening the consulship to the plebeians, saw its decree documented with much fanfare. Scribes debated the ink drying time extensively before the final version was presented to the Senate. The decision to allow a drying time of 8 minutes was influenced by the weight of the law, showcasing how even minor figures could impact significant legal changes. 2. The Gracchi Reforms, 133 to 121 BCE, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, known for their populist reforms, faced a slew of opposition. During the heated discussions surrounding these reforms, the ink drying time became a point of contention. The scribe responsible for recording Tiberius's land reform proposal was chastised for rushing the drying process, resulting in a miswritten phrase that altered the interpretation of the law. The drying time was set at a strict 10 minutes for future documentation, leading to a backlog of legislative proposals and debates. 3. The rise of Julius Caesar, 49 BCE, as Caesar's power grew, so did the urgency of Senate decrees. During this tumultuous time, the drying time was reduced to a mere 5 minutes in an effort to keep up with the rapidly changing political landscape. However, This hastiness led to numerous errors in the documentation of laws that would haunt the Senate for years to come, as mistakes in phrasing were later used against senators in political rivalries. 4. The Augustus Reforms, 27 BCE. When Augustus reformed the Senate, he placed great emphasis on clarity and accuracy in documentation. The drying time was standardized to 7 minutes. Augustus understood that the perception of the Senate's efficiency depended on its ability to present clear and unambiguous decrees. This standardization was a minor yet critical reform that helped stabilize the Senate's image during a period of transition. Comparisons to other regions. While the Roman Senate grappled with ink drying times, other regions and civilizations were also developing their bureaucratic practices. In ancient China, for instance, the use of ink and brush was common, yet the drying times were not as strictly monitored. The Chinese scribes often used rice paper, which absorbed ink differently than the parchment favored in Rome. This led to quicker drying times, a factor that contributed to the rapid documentation of legal codes and imperial edicts. The Chinese bureaucratic system, heavily influenced by Confucian ideals, placed great importance on the accuracy of documentation but did not obsess over drying times as the Romans did. Could it be that Roman obsession with ink drying times was a reflection of their more complex political landscape? In the Persian Empire, bureaucratic practices were similarly advanced, but the region's use of clay tablets often meant that drying times were irrelevant. Instead, the focus lay on the permanence of cuneiform writing, which petrified decisions in a way that ink on parchment could never replicate. This raises an interesting question: how might the permanence of a decision affect the political climate in Rome had they adopted a similar approach? Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological discoveries have unearthed several artifacts that shed light on the minutiae of Roman ink usage. In 2017, a cache of writing instruments was found in an ancient Roman villa in Pompeii, revealing an array of quills, ink pots, and parchment fragments. Analysis of the inks, made from carbon black and various binding agents, indicated varying drying times based on the composition. Furthermore, inscriptions in the ruins of the Senate House have provided insights into the preferred ink types used by senators. The quality of the ink was often directly correlated with the status of the senator. High-ranking officials used a richer, slower-drying ink, while lower-ranking scribes resorted to cheaper, faster-drying options. This disparity in ink quality not only affected the drying times but also the legibility and longevity of the documents produced. Could it be that the quality of ink served as a status symbol in a society obsessed with hierarchy? The human element. Beyond the petty rules and minor figures, the human element of ink drying times must not be overlooked. The practice of waiting for ink to dry often allowed senators and scribes a moment to reflect on the weight of their words. In these moments of stillness, they considered the implications of their decisions on the Roman populace and the empire at large. However, not all senators were patient. There are accounts of senators becoming frustrated with the delays caused by ink drying. Tacitus notes in his annals that one senator, exasperated by the slow pace of legislative procedures, once declared, "Shall we wait for the ink to dry, or shall we forge our destinies now?" The resulting laughter from his peers highlighted a shared understanding of the absurdity of such a fixation. Two rhetorical questions to hook curiosity. As we ponder the seemingly trivial nature of ink drying times in the Roman Senate, one cannot help but ask, how many critical decisions have been altered by the simple act of waiting for ink to dry? And, could the course of Roman history have shifted dramatically had senators not been so meticulous about the minutiae of their documentation practices? In conclusion, while the history of the Roman Senate may be filled with grand speeches and monumental decisions, the unexciting details surrounding Quill ink drying times reveal an intriguing layer of this complex institution. The minor figures and petty rules that govern their practices, the case studies that highlight the importance of ink drying times in pivotal moments, and the comparisons to other regions all contribute to a richer understanding of the bureaucracy that helped shape one of history's greatest civilizations. The archaeological finds and the human stories behind the ink and parchment serve as reminders that even the most mundane aspects of governance can have far-reaching consequences. So, the next time one thinks of the Roman Senate, let us not forget the quiet scribes, the petty rules, and the ink that dried under the weight of history. And that's a wrap. We've unraveled the mysteries of topic faster than you can say, "What did I just learn?" Remember, knowledge is power, but it's also a great party trick. Here's a surprising nugget. Did you know that? Insert surprising fact. Mind-blowing, right? If you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Your thoughts fuel our next adventure. And if you're craving more, check out our related episodes that dive even deeper into related topics. And hey, if you want to drift off while soaking in all this knowledge, turn on loop and let this episode play on repeat until you dream of funny or relevant dream topic. Sweet dreams.